What you need for a basic setup, I'm going to go ahead and show you how this works exactly. Alright, so here we have our drop cloth, and what I'm going to do is go ahead, tear off some tape. Now what I tend to do with all my setups is I hang my drop cloth over the edge of the table just a little bit, wrap it. That's just in case any kind of spurious drops of ink or little bits of A&D or any random things might, hit the edge of the table. It'll keep it from seeping underneath your drop cloth or dropping onto the floor a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a demonstration of different types of tubes you can use. Now, this here is a industry standard type of tube. It's a stainless steel combination of a tube stem, which is mounted in the chuck, the release part of the tattoo. It tightens it, little vice clamp. The tube grip and the tube tip, which is the needle runs through the tube stem, through the grip, into the tip, and the tip of the needle is shaped according to what type of needle grouping you're using. And again, the rubber bands pull the needle into place and it guides it down the actual tube stem into the tip, and it keeps it in the same place. So this is the pretty much the general type of tube you're going to find in any tattoo shop. It's all made out of stainless steel. It's 3 pieces, and it is autoclavable, which is in this sealed package and sterilized after each use. Well, it's clean and then sterilized. And you have a individually packaged pre-sterilized tube, which is disposable, which is opened prior to a tattoo, used once, and then thrown away after it's done. This is made out of plastic. It's pretty much straightforward. It's all made out of one solid piece. There's no 3 separate pieces in this. One solid piece of plastic that's used and thrown away after it's done. This is generally used for any kind of people that are on the road doing conventions and stuff like that. It's easier to transport. It's easier to work in that type of event and that environment without having to bring an autoclave with you, because the size of the thing, it's very expensive if you break it, and it's clunky and there's not a lot of space for it. So it's a lot easier to just grab a box of these things and throw them away when you're done. And the third and final type of setup I'm showing you right now is the particular type that I use when I'm tattooing. It's a relatively newer style of tube and tip setup, but basically what it is this I will explain to you right now. Alright, you have the tube stem, the grip, and this has a release on it. So basically it's unscrewed, and you have individually packaged and sterilized tube tips. So you open your tip up, this slides into the end of this, and basically what this is a different type of vise. You have a threaded barrel, and this goes over the tip of that, and then basically once it's tightened down, it contracts on that and then squeezes the tube tip into place. So you loosen it up just a little bit, slide your tip into place, tighten it down, and then that's it. Now, as far as the actual needle setup goes, for the tattoo, I'm doing the setup for this. It's going to be an 8-round liner. Now, there's a lot of different variations of tattoo needles. It's pretty much limitless. Anything you could possibly imagine as far as size-wise, the amount of needle groupings. It's something akin to a set of markers. You have very fine ballpoints, you have large felt tips, like magic markers, Sharpies, you have pretty much an infinite variety of different sizes and thicknesses and shapes you could use, which is why it's tattooing. It's the best way to do it, to set it up, is to try to get it very close to how you would draw something. That way it's something that's more natural to you. It's something that you've been doing for however long you've been drawing for, and you try to translate tattooing into into as close to as how you do a drawing as possible. So you try to find different types of needle groupings that would be similar to something that you would use. Now an 8 round liner, which is what I have here in my hand, is a thicker liner as opposed to a single liner or 3 liner, 5 or 7, but it's not massive. You can get 14 round liners all the way up to 100 round liners, but this will give you a decent sized thick line, but it's a relatively tight grouping. So what happens when you have a tight grouping of a lot of needles, it creates good line integrity. You have a nice thick solid line, and it doesn't require too much building, so you don't have to go over too many times to build up a nice thick line. And you can also calligraphy with this thing very well. What I mean by that is, if you're pulling a line, it's very easy to just kind of lighten up the stroke, and then the line will taper itself out. So you can vary your line thickness very easily with this type of needle. But basically, as far as the setup goes, what you want to do is, once you pull the needle out of the package, you kind of have to check and see by eye, make sure it's straight. Now you want to make sure the bar is actually straight. So you kind of gun sight it. Just look down the length of the needle, make sure the bar is straight. And the way you want to set it up, you want to make sure the needle itself, it's soldered on one side of the bar. And the side that it's soldered on, you kind of want to deflect it up a little bit. So basically, if you were to lay the needle flat, you want the needle grouping toward the tip to be sticking up just a little bit. And that will ensure that when it's riding in the tube, the tip of the needle is actually riding at the bottom of the tip of the tube. And that'll keep it from spraying ink and kind of bouncing around a little bit. So once you have your bar lined up straight and your needle in the correct position, what you want to do, just grab your tube, hold the needle lightly, guide the needle into the tip of the tube, the end of the tube, and just gently let it slide down there. In the case you were to bump the side of the wall of the tube, you don't want to bend the tip of the needle. So you just gently let it slide in there. And when it gets to the bottom, what I do is I actually push the actual needle bar against the tube, so it's sitting in there nice and flush, and then you let it go, and it'll actually, what it does is it spins itself around and it guides itself into the tip of the tube. Now these tube tips are actually plastic, so if the tips of the needles do bump it, just slightly, the weight of the needle will not create enough force to bend the tip of that. And it is plastic, so it's much more forgiving than metal. So basically, once you have that in there, and you take your tattoo machine, move your rubber bands up so they're out of the way. You want to loosen your chuck and slide the grouping in through the bottom and get it relatively close to where it's sitting flush to the top. Tighten the chuck just so it's snug but not tight. You still want to be able to move it around. And then you want to take your grommet. Now this is important. You want to make sure the tip of the needle, again, like I said, the needle is soldered on it's on one side of the armature bar. On one side of the needle bar. And you want the needle to be riding in the bottom. So once you have the needle lined up correctly, pop your grommet in place, and then just gently guide the needle up, and then push your eyelet over the armature bar. And then you can fine-tune the adjustment. So what you do work the needle tube tip down And everybody has a different setup. Some people like to use the actual tube tip itself as a guide, and some people like to have their needle hanging out and work directly off the needle. Now this is all preference. Me personally, I like the needle hanging out a little bit so I can see the needle where it actually goes into the skin. In my personal opinion, when you have the needle kind of hidden in there and you're working off the tube tip, even though it's small, it's big enough to kind of obscure where your line is. But it is also a way to guide the amount of, guide the depth. It'll help keep the needle from going in further than what you would want. And if it's hanging out too far and you're pushing too far in and you try to pull a line, what's going to happen is it's going to kind of hang up. The needle won't be able to pull itself all the way out of the skin, and it'll kind of stop. So what I do, again, is I just have my needle hanging out just a little bit out of the tip of the tube. Tighten it up. And then I take my rubber bands and I spin them around a couple times to make sure they get lined up and they're not bound up around each other or twisted. And spread them apart just a little bit, just to give myself a little bit of spacing between the rubber bands and a little wider grip on the actual needle bar. And that's the basic setup that you want to use with your machine.